Hey everybody, my name is Daniel Rogers and welcome back to our series on Revelation. In the last video, we were in Revelation chapter 12, looking at verses 1 through 9, which was kind of a blunder on my part. I should have stuck to verse 6, but I was trying to make it like half and half, so oh well. Verses 7 through 9, though, better fit, I think, with verses 10 through 17. What happens in Revelation 12 is we get the same vision in two different ways back to back, really emphasizing the recapitulatory nature of the book of Revelation. And so let's begin back in verse 7 through 9, just to read the text, and I'll go directly into verse 10. There was war in heaven, Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon. The dragon and his angels waged war, and they were not strong enough, and there's no longer a place found for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, and he who accuses them before our God day and night. Let's pause there and take a look back at chapter 11, just for a moment, and verse 10 or verse 15. In the days of the seventh angel, he says, the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he'll reign forever and ever. So it seems like the climax of chapter 11 and the seventh trumpet is what we're reading about in verse 10 of chapter 12. And this gets very awkward when you're talking about the timing of all these things. But let's keep going. Verse 11. They overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimony. And they did not love their life even when faced with death. Now let's keep in mind that the thing that overcomes is the blood of the Lamb. In chapter 19, whenever Jesus appears on a white horse and he's soaked in blood, some people will think that he's soaked in the blood of his enemies, which is a guess that one could make. However, it's better to see that his blood-soaked robes as being his own blood, because again, he's a lamb who is standing even though he's been slain. And so the thing that causes them to overcome Satan is the blood of the Lamb. This is why, of course, Satan is trying to get Jesus to bow down before him in Matthew chapter 4, and is always attempting to prevent his death, like through Peter in Matthew chapter 16. So they overcome through the blood of the Lamb, but they also overcome because of the word of their testimony, and they did not love their life even when faced with death. Perhaps you'd be familiar with some texts from the gospel accounts, like, for example, in Matthew chapter 10. There Jesus is telling his disciples about a limited commission that they were given and things like that, which all that stuff is, again, not the content of this video. But he says in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 38 and 39, he who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. He who has found his life will lose it. He who has lost his life for my sake will find it. Similarly, in Matthew chapter 16, when Jesus is talking about his own death, he says to them in Matthew chapter 16 and verse 25, he says, whoever wishes to save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Again, it's a similar thing. They did not love their life even when faced with death. That is, they're not taking out their sword to defend themselves. They're willingly going to death just as Jesus died on the cross. Keep in mind that the Apostle Peter, in the context of telling his readers to not mistreat authority, he tells them to follow the path of Christ. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as the one in authority, or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and the praise of those who do right. For such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. He says, act as free men, and do not use your freedom as a covering for evil, but use it as bondslaves of God. Honor all people. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the king. And then we realize in verse 18 that the servants were to be submissive to their masters with all respect, not because Peter was trying to uphold the institution of slavery, but because they didn't want the church to be perceived as a violent revolution and overthrowing the social order through force. Instead, they could do it with grace, with humility, and with love. Later on in this text, in verse 21, chapter 2 of 1 Peter, he says, you've been called for this person, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. While being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. And so, he tells them, you need to follow the same path. And so these people in verse 11 of chapter 12 of Revelation, I keep saying it backwards, they don't live their life even with facing death because they believe the testimony concerning the blood of the Lamb. And that's what's different between those who have the mark of God versus those who have the mark of the beast. Verse 12, for this reason, rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, knowing that he only has a short time. Now this is interesting, knowing that he only has a short time. Notice what we have in Revelation chapter 12. We have Jesus reigning on his throne, and then the devil having a short time to bring tribulation on the earth and to deceive the whole earth. This is probably not the time to get into this. We'll have to get into this later. But in Revelation chapter 20, we have the binding of Satan for 1,000 years. And then after these things, verse 3, he's released for a short time. Then there's judgment, and there's war, and there's all sorts of things, and Christ is reigning, etc., etc., etc. He'll be released from prison to go out and deceive the nations, etc. There's violence, and then it ends with the victory of Jesus. What we have in Revelation chapter 12 is the same exact story, but without the millennium in between the beginning and the end of the story. We just go straight through. It's kind of like Daniel chapter 9, where there's no gap between the first half of the seventh week and the second half of the seventh week or whatever. Instead, it just goes straight through. Same thing is happening in Revelation 12. This is the picture of the millennium of chapter 20 all at once. Jesus goes to his throne. The devil's released for a short time, as he says in verse 12, to deceive the world and to persecute the saints. Notice how this short time is identified as we move to verse 13. When the dragon saw that he was thrown down to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. That's what we see in the beginning of the 7th decade of the 1st century, the persecution of the church, unlike it was at any other time. But the 2 wings of the great eagle were given to the woman so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place where she was nourished for a time, a times, and a half a time from the presence of the serpent. So when he goes to persecute the church for the short time, it ends up happening that she is rescued. And who does he end up destroying? He ends up destroying those who follow the way of Satan, those who picked up the sword and are doomed to perish with the sword. Notice that she's nourished for a time, times, and half a time. If you go back, you see that this is the short time of verse 12, but this is also the 1,260 days of verse 6, which corresponds with the 1,260 days or the 42 months of chapter 11, meaning that the events in chapter 11, the 42 months, the 1,260 days in chapter 11, as well as in chapter 12, correspond to the short time following the millennium of Revelation chapter 20. Really fascinating stuff. There's more we could bring out on this from 1 Peter chapter 1 and the little while of a fiery trial, but that's advanced information that we'll get into when we get to chapter 20. Okay, verse 15. And the serpent poured water out like a river out of his mouth after the woman, so that it might cause her to be swept away with the flood. What happens though? Verse 16, the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and drank up the river, which the dragon poured out of his mouth. Now, isn't this what happens in verse 12? Those who dwelled on the earth are soaking up the wrath of the serpent that was intended for the people of God. Now, isn't that interesting? Who is it that brings about the destruction of Jerusalem? We might think that it would be God, that it would be Jesus as the active force in that. What we see here in Revelation chapter 12, it's actually the activity of Satan. It's actually the activity of the devil. And what it ends up being is Jesus's words are fulfilled. If you go the way of Satan, it will end up destroying you. And that's what's happening in Revelation chapter 12. That's why Jesus weeps over Jerusalem. Not because he was going to have to one day go down there and get them, but because they would end up destroying themselves because they were of their father, the devil, by taking the way of violent retribution. Okay, verse 17. So the dragon was enraged with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her children who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And this is what we're going to see in chapters 13 and following. And we'll get a good taste of the 2 beasts in the next video. Everybody's, I'm sure, excited about that. Go ahead and be prepared to be sorely disappointed in the following videos. Okay, I'll pause there and we'll continue next time.